There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms, and I'm sitting across the table from one Nephi Cole.
Still here.
You are still here. You were here last week.
Yep.
You're still here this week. I was not here last week.
Yep.
And Mike is not here this week.
It always feels a little awkward since we're in Mike's house without Mike. But hey, whatever.
Yeah, things happen. Schedules work out this way.
Yeah.
This is...
If Mike wants to drive away and go places.
Look, we've been doing this long enough now that I kind of view this as our studio.
Yeah, it's kind of, this belongs to us.
Really, it does.
Yeah. It's, what's the legal term for this? Adverse possession?
Yeah, he doesn't know. Yeah, we could call it adverse possession.
Clearly this spot, this is my chair.
Yeah, and I'm sitting in Mike's chair. I've staked my claim,
Yep.
Adversely possessing his
If he
chair.
doesn't do anything in 7 years, it's yours.
Yeah, if he doesn't sit in it again for 7 years.
Yeah.
Or try and claim it again. Yeah, maybe adverse possession is not the what we're actually doing. We're moochers.
I'm no attorney.
I'm barely one.
Yeah. Officially, you still can,
Yeah, I have a license.
Yeah.
Nobody's taking it from me. So before we dive into today's topic, I've got two things that I wanted to touch on. One of them is I want to thank everybody. So as you know, we took a bit of a hiatus to go out and do a bunch of hunting, and I was really worried that was going to, that people were going to stop listening and they wouldn't come back. But that hasn't been the case at all. And so I just want to say to everybody out there, thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for listening. We really appreciate you, and we really appreciate all the feedback that you've given us through, through your ratings that you've left places and through social media and emails. We just appreciate you. So in the spirit of this Thanksgiving season, I just want to give some thanks for everybody that's helping us keep this podcast going.
That was nice, Dave. I'll say the same thing in shorter words. Thank you, everyone.
You shorter? It just blew my mind. It must mean you're really holding on to something for later. So the second thing is, if any of you have watched The Family Guy out there, they had this segment. There was this one episode where Peter got on a TV show, and he had a segment, and it was called Grind My Gears. This is something that really grinds my gears. Right? We're not going to do a segment on this. I'm just saying, I'm about to tell you something that really grinds my gears, and that's where it's coming from. I want to give credit where credit is due to the Family Guy creators. So here's the deal. Here's what happened. And this is a problem, I think. And I know, Nephi, you wanted to touch on something too around this. And so I recently had to get a hunter mentor to hunt in another state. This is the second time this has happened to me in just over a year, where I've had to get a hunter mentor to be able to hunt in another state.
Who's your mentor?
I'm not going to name names.
I wish you would, because I want to be able to say, like, that you learned something. He'd appreciate it.
Well, he and she. So I hunted in Missouri in 2018, and my hunter mentor was one Kelly Myers.
Yeah.
Who's been on this podcast before. And then recently I was hunting in Colorado with Ed Arnett from the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And he had to be my hunter mentor to hunt in Colorado.
Well, Ed, you should really do a better job.
Because
Dave has a lot.
I need a lot more mentorship.
If you're gonna step up and be a mentor, then maybe you should just not just go halfway there. Maybe you should walk, both miles, as the biblical connotation.
So let me explain what I think is the problem. Most people wouldn't have gone to these lengths to find a hunter mentor to hunt in this state. Most people might not know they could have done this. What I want to I'm mentioning is I think there is a problem. We're talking about declining hunter numbers. We're down 2 million hunters over the past 5-6 years, down to about 11.5 million in the country, right? So we're down hunter numbers wise. We're down. There are multiple impediments to getting into hunting, but we should be being, individuals helping each other and state agencies managing the wildlife should be making it as easy as possible to facilitate getting into the field to hunt and getting new hunters, right? So here's what happened. And you can all write in and tell me that, I just need to plan better and this wouldn't be a problem. But you can buy, in many states, you can buy licenses online now. And you can save them on your phone, or you can print the licenses off and carry them in the field. You don't actually have to go into an agency headquarter building or regional office or sporting goods store or wherever you go to buy your license. A lot of these things you can buy online. And what I was buying were bird licenses. I was just looking to hunt birds, right? You can buy those online. You can buy them online in Missouri. You can buy them online in Colorado. But before you can buy a license, you have to be able to prove that you have passed hunter safety, that you have a hunter safety card, right? And there's, at least in those 2 states, there's no mechanism to prove that online. You have to physically take your card or your number in someplace to have it proven before you can be authorized an account to buy licenses online. And so this is where I say most people would say, just plan ahead. Well, in both of my situations, I didn't have a lot of time to plan ahead. I was responding to kind of last-minute invitations, and it was, in the case of my Missouri hunt, it was the middle of the night. I went into a couple of Walmarts to buy a license, and the Walmart license selling stations were closed for the night. It was midnight or 1 a.m, and I was on my way. I had a similar instance with Colorado. It was 3 a.m. I was on my way to Colorado to duck hunt. There was there's nothing open, no place for me to prove this. So it was an impediment at that point. And so the only way I could get it to be able to buy that license online was to sign up for the Hunter Mentor Program and go with somebody that was already in the system, which is what I did in both of those states. And then I was able to buy my license. You can only do that one time. So, now I can't have the Hunter Mentor again. I have to physically go into the office, and I'll do that, and I'll be okay in those states. But it seems like it's a pretty easy, like it's a problem in search of a solution, right? Because we've got this situation where every state recognizes every other state. If you've received a hunter safety certificate in any state, every other state recognizes that. So why can't we have some sort of centralized database where that information is populated, so when you go on that ties into the state
I'm going to
system?
make your day.
Are you working on it?
We're going to have a guest on now, and we're going to invite him, Simon Tafoya. You remember Simon? He worked for Colorado, for the governor of Colorado.
Okay.
Now works with an organization that's working with natural resource-based agencies on digital products. And they're working with people on like being able to get like a state parks passes on your phone, and even tags on your phone.
Yeah.
How you could do that. So they're trying to find game and fish agencies who want to partner with them to launch this technology where you or I could buy an elk tag and have that elk tag just appear on your phone. And then when you get the tag, you could like literally bang, push the stuff on, and then that information, because you know how they right now they do afterwards they ask like, oh, where'd you get your elk at? They do surveys and stuff. Yeah. Like you would just punch it on your phone. All that information would immediately just boom, be available to the game and fish. It would simplify the process. It'd be better for sportsmen and would provide a huge amount of data to the Natural Resource Agency, eliminate paper, eliminate costs. And there are places that are working on this right now, and they are. I think it's exciting.
Well, I hope they do, because I don't know if I can find a mentor in every state. And I usually am kind of last minute with I take last minute invitations and just get in the car and go. So it's something that's like, I was able to figure out how to still make it work because I had represented a wildlife agency in the past and kind of knew the system and opportunities most of the public might not know about. And so it might be something where they get that invitation, find out they can't buy the license because they don't have their hunter's
We need to do a better job.
And so they're they're like, well, I guess I'm not going to go. And that costs that local economy money. That keeps people from, now I'm already a hunter. You're not recruiting me, but you know, it could have an impact.
You know, this is something that, you know, I just wrote this down because I think it's important. I've heard, and I'm going to pick on, you know, another podcast that I listen to, and I respect some of the guys who work on that podcast or work in that group. But there's this mentality almost with some people about this gatekeeper mentality where they're like, oh, well, if you're going to go hunt, then you should have to, you know, there's a base level of safety and knowledge that we all need to have, admitted. But there's folks who, they kind of have this idea. It's like, oh, well, you know, they go on a eulogy about how cool it is that in some place in Europe you have to take like a, you know, 6-month course and learn how to, you know, identify different kinds of bees and trees before you can get into the field, and that then the hunter is revered and he's very important. Like, I mean, that elitism, that gatekeeper nature, I think that's a real problem to us getting people into hunting and the shooting sports. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, we all want to get to that level of like, we're at the top of the mountain, we have so much understanding. But if we require people, if we keep people out of, why wouldn't we take a step back and take a look at all these ideas and thoughts from the last 100 years and say, how are we fencing people out?
Right.
Let's get rid of those.
Right. And what I was talking about, it's not even really, I'm not talking about changing any of the requirements.
Yeah.
I'm saying the requirements are fine. Every state recognizes the other state's administration of a hunter safety test and requires that you pass hunter safety.
Yeah.
That's fine. Just get with the 21st century here. And let's get the technology lined up with the requirements to make it as easy as possible to get into the field.
I agree. But isn't that what we're talking about? Is like everybody's like, well, this is the tradition. This is the way we've always done it. And why would we make it easier? And they literally think that somebody that is in their head is going like, well, we don't want to make it too easy because then somebody might take advantage of the system, or some kid, might get out and might get a deer tag and they're not ready to hunt deer, in my area where I hunt deer. There's this, it's a backwards mentality, and other people have it. It's like people who hoard areas. David Wilson.
I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about there.
But in, joking with you, but in seriousness, this, have you heard people say before? It's like, well, I don't know if I want more people out like hunting in my area because, well, that short-sighted view of that protectionist nature of like, oh, I'm gonna hoard these opportunities for myself, and I'm not talking about like, you don't do that with everything. You share areas with people, so I'm not talking about your special spot. Yeah. But there are a lot of people who like every spot's their special spot. In fact, if they could just have nobody else out there hunting, they'd do it.
I'll tell you what, though, we talk about, and by we I mean collectively the hunting community, talk about needing to recruit, retain, reactivate hunters, and how that's the key to maintaining our influence and heritage. And while that's somewhat true, I actually wish the community would focus more on one other piece. And it's the fact that 95% of the population doesn't hunt, and our ability to continue to have the lifestyle we like and the heritage we like, to be quite honest, and look at what's happening in California, right? With the erosion of some of these historical practices for hunting. It depends on the non-hunting community supporting what we're doing. And I actually think we need to invest a lot more time and resources in educating the non-hunting community about the value of hunting and keeping that, because we're at over 80% support for hunting for food in this country, right? Of people in this country. And that's what we need to maintain, because we start losing that, we wind up with the problems California's having with losing mountain lion season,
bear with me here.
Trapping, all that stuff.
I agree with you, and bear with me here.
But we should do both. I'm not saying don't do the other.
No, but the problem is we're trying to bifurcate these things. We're acting like that they are different problems when in fact they are not.
No, I agree with you.
Because what happens is when people, we are acting like, there's 5% of us, the star-bellied sneetches, and they cannot be us, and so we're going to stay in our lane. Right? When the real issue is, if we're more inclusive, like, yes, only 5% of the population hunts. Well, guess what? It could be 10. Now, the reality is if it's 10, that doesn't, you're not going to get a tag as often as an individual maybe.
Yeah, well, that 10% is not going to be in my place, so no.
Yeah. But the reality is, and it's not just hunting, right? Like people who we bring into this community, the shooting sports community, or to be frank, the gun owner community. Like, right? 5% of the population hunts, a whole lot larger percentage owns a firearm. Those people need to understand hunter ethics too. Like, we need those people to be thinking about what that means and if they would like to come hunt with us. Because even if they're not going hunting every year, like, if we can increase the size of the tent, we've got more opportunity, which brings me to my gripe. Like, some of these laws that we have, or regulations even in some states, they're, without trying to be, and I'm sure that they're well-meaning, like, they create exclusion and they remove opportunity from somebody to otherwise participate in this endeavor. And I'm just going to use an example: straight-walled cartridges. I'm sure somebody's going to take offense at this because there's some state where somebody's going to tell me, like, this was a really great idea when we came up with it. Because the 30-06 was way too powerful and dangerous for us to be using in some situation. Well, while there may not have been great alternatives when you made the decision for a shotgun only area, for shotguns only in this entire state or something like that, or for something else, whatever that exclusion is that we placed, we probably it's time to take a look at those things, because with new technology and then again, new people coming into the sport, new tools, maybe there's an opportunity now. Maybe we need to open up the tent and take a look at how, whatever that problem was that we were trying to solve, we can probably take a new look at how to solve that problem today and bring new people into the sport if we're willing to open the doors a little bit. So that's my beef.
I've got an idea for us.
Yes.
Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. You and I will get Mike to do it too. And anybody that wants to chime in that's listening, this would be great. What are the most obstructionist laws in your state? Let's start compiling a list of
what's keeping people out of the field.
Yeah, the laws and regulations that are unnecessarily keeping people out of the field, or that maybe serve some purpose but could be modified in some way to the present day to encourage more people into the field. I'm going to put that out there right now for our listeners, because we're going to do some independent. I think we should do some independent research, but I know we've got listeners scattered all over the country, and I think it would be great if we could get some thoughts from you all listening. Shoot us an email at yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. Tell us what those are. We'll dig into it. We'll start putting together a list.
I'm going to drop a bone now.
Yeah.
To our friend running for president, Steven Ranella. And if anybody hasn't seen that, it's hilarious.
Tighten your tie.
But the thing that he said, like, we talk about access sometimes, and we limit access. People say, "Oh, access." Like, land is the only thing we need to worry about. I was writing a recent article, and one of the things I looked at was, things I'm saying is like, look, we access. When you looked at, we did something really cool at the turn of the 19th century, which is hunters. We figured out that we didn't have animals, and really that was our limiting factor, was access to the resource. And now we've addressed this, and people talk about access to land, but really what we need to look about, in a bigger picture, it's just access to opportunity. It's access to the opportunity, and
it's everything. It's everything.
Sometimes that's the place. Sometimes that's the tool to do the job.
Sometimes that's the animal.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a regulatory restriction that's, keeping you as an out-of-stater from being able to buy a tag. That's your limitation on access. We need to chop down these limitations. We need to make access, that has to be the priority. And it's not just access to land. It is access to the opportunity for hunting and fishing, shooting sport. That's what we're talking about.
So everybody listening, help us out. Help identify some of those.
What's the impediment? What's keeping you from being able to do the thing you love?
Yeah. All right.
There you go.
So I look forward to hearing from everybody. and maybe we'll put together an article or something. Maybe we'll do another podcast on it.
Yeah, be fun.
Yeah, something like that. But we'll get more. Who knows? Maybe we'll use it in our day jobs and start pushing for some change some places.
We do need to. We actually have. Yeah, I will.
Yeah, me too. All right. So what we really came, now that we're 20 minutes into
halfway
this,
in.
Yeah, halfway in. What we really wanted to talk about in this particular podcast from a policy standpoint. Oh, this is all really good policy stuff, actually.
Yeah.
There's some really good policy stuff here. But we wanted to talk about the big bad grizzly bear. Right?
Have you seen one up close in person?
More than one.
Me too.
Yeah. I don't know how many.
They're
have
like
you seen?
Volkswagens. You know, I've probably only seen about 10 bears. But I've seen some of them pretty close while I was hunting, and that's spooky.
Yeah, so I guess that I've seen a lot more than that, but part of it is because I saw a whole bunch concentrated on a moth site rolling rocks, and so when you see 15 or 20 in one spot, that really ups your number.
They're impressive. They're bigger than this desk.
It's a big desk too. But we're not here to talk about how big and nasty they are or not nasty they are.
We're here to talk policy.
We're here to talk policy. So for those of you that aren't familiar, let me just step you through the history of grizzly bears. And I'm going to focus, we're going to start with the history of grizzly bears in the U.S. broad, real quick, fast picture. But really what the whole point of this is to focus on the greater Yellowstone area.
Yep.
So the Wyoming, Idaho, Montana population around Yellowstone, in and around Yellowstone National Park. That's going to be the main focus. But to get there, we got to talk about a little the history. We're not going to go back 150 years or 3,000 years. But what I'll tell you is when the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, and we've talked about the Endangered Species Act a lot, but when the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, grizzly bears wound up being one of the first large mammals put on that list. It was put on the list in 1975. At the time that it went on the list, some of the estimates, and I'm just going to say these are estimates because there was a range, but at the low end of the estimates, the estimated population in the greater Yellowstone area was 136 grizzly bears. Now, back up from that, there are some people out there, and I hate to use the general sense without calling them out, but I don't know who they are. So there are some people out there, some people out that have said historically in the United States, across the continent, pre-European settlement, that there could have been up to 50,000 grizzly bears. I question that, and the reason I question that is, as you'll hear a little bit later, when we talk about the modeling of populations in the greater Yellowstone area and how this is one of the most studied grizzly bear populations or any population on the planet. And
if you just take how much area those bears need and then you extrapolate it across the U.S., the numbers don't work.
But not just, I'm not even talking that. I'm saying the population estimate that we come up with is within this gigantic range. We have a pretty good idea that there's at least so many bears, but we could be underestimating it by, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's with today's technology and everything. So I'm not going to, let's just say there were more bears. There were bears in San Francisco. There were present day San Francisco. There are bears all over the West, but what we're going to talk about is this greater Yellowstone area. And that population crashed in the 70s after the national park system shut down garbage dumps. Garbage dumps used to be a pretty popular feeding location for grizzly bears in the national park, and it helped artificially maintain elevated grizzly bear populations. When those dumps were closed down and grizzly bears had to act more like bears and search for other food, their populations crashed, and we were sitting at about 136 bears. Right? So they were listed as threatened in the entire lower 48 states. But again, we're focusing on this one area. And the biologists from all the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service, they all got together and said, okay, let's set out a roadmap for recovery. What's it going to take to recover grizzly bears? And the first thing they did is said, okay, we're going to create recovery areas. So in the lower 48 states, they created 5 different grizzly bear recovery areas. The idea was if you recover one of those, you can delist that population, and because we have under the Endangered Species Act what's called a distinct population segment. So if you have this population that's not genetically connected to another population, you can delist it. So the service created these 5 areas, and the greater Yellowstone area was one of them. Right? So once that was established, they said, okay, so what we'll do is we'll put together recovery criteria. We'll say, here's what's necessary, biologically necessary to recover the grizzly bear to the point that they don't need the protections of the act, and we can delist that population. Pretty straightforward, right?
Yep, put a number of bears out there.
Well, so that's funny. You should say that because that number fluctuates over time. But I'll use the most recent. I'll use the most recent number. So it was maintain a minimum population of 500 grizzly bears. Maintain a minimum of 48 females with cubs of the year, and they created these management units, 18 bear management units in this recovery area of the greater Yellowstone area. And so 16 of those 18 management units had to be occupied by female bears with young of the year, and they couldn't have 2 adjacent units unoccupied. So that was it. That's the recovery standard.
Most recent?
No.
No.
that's mostly the most recent. There's a, well, I should say, and then you can't meet, there are these annual mortality limits for males and females, right, that you have to meet. And yeah, those are the most
I might be jumping in front of you here.
Before you do,
okay.
Those were, that was the recent, that was the prior. There was one thing added to the recent, but this was the recovery objective for the longest time. Those recovery objectives were met in 2003.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just going to say, so here's what I was going to jump in front of you. I was in a meeting, like literally with Dan Ash and his top deputies, like 4 governors, one of whom is running for president right now. And guess what everybody agreed on around the table? Everybody agreed that they are recovered. Yeah, they were arguing about how to count them.
Yeah, and
but everybody agrees. Like they're like, yeah, they're recovered. The problem is we got to agree on how to count them, because if we don't, then we're going to get sued. But everybody knew they were recovered.
Yeah, and so even take the governors out of that. All the biologists that were on the recovery teams from all the different state and federal agencies
all know they're recovered.
They all say they're recovered.
Yeah,
right? Everybody. I'm not here to dispute the fact that grizzly bears are recovered. I'm here to tell you that they're recovered. I'm not gonna.
Thank you for the endorsement.
I'm just saying. I'm not going to present. We always present the alternative. I'm not going to present the alternative in this instance because I'm not a biologist. I'm not a bear biologist. I'm going to trust what the bear biologists have all said, that grizzly bears of this most studied grizzly bear population on the planet are recovered and warrant delisting.
And then quickly, I think that the argument from those who don't want them delisted, it isn't that we didn't meet the recovery criteria that were set before and that are valid now. It has to do, it's beyond that. It's they want more than that.
Yeah, it's a couple of things.
That's kind of where you get to.
Every groups have different thoughts. Some of them hate the idea that grizzly bears could be hunted. And so the way to prevent them from being hunted is to just keep them listed forever. Others say they might be recovered here, but that doesn't mean they're actually recovered. They need to be recovered.
Because there aren't any in Denver.
They need to be recovered across the lower 48 states. We need to connect this population to the population in the northern Cascades, up there by Glacier National Park. We need to, we need to see bears in central Idaho. I mean, all
great and noble goals. Just that's not what we set out and we promised to do when we actually made this agreement at the beginning with the states and then the recovery and got the criteria.
I've heard landowners say this. It was a contract. There's a contract with landowners, and we can dispute what it is. That was what folks on the ground, the state officials, and the landowners dealing with the bears every day thought. Recovery plan was a contract with the Fish and Wildlife Service to say if we get to this point, we're going to delist them. And to be fair, the Fish and Wildlife Service did delist them. twice.
That's right. It's not like it's not for lack of trying, right?
Yeah. So the Fish and Wildlife Service delisted them twice. The first time back in 2007, they were delisted, and a court ultimately, a federal district court and then a circuit court ultimately reinstated protections for them, saying, basically the gist of it was there's one issue left. It was Fish and Wildlife Service had failed to account for the loss of whitebark pine, which whitebark pine had been attacked by a pine beetle, and whitebark pine nuts, according to the service in their rule, were a primary food source of grizzly bears. Well, what we know now is they are a primary food source of some grizzly bears at a certain time of year, but if they're not available, those bears find other food sources because they're opportunistic omnivores, and they have some 200 plus different food items that they munch on.
That was a preferred munchie. It wasn't a necessary prohibiting factor.
But the rule was unclear about whether it was necessary and what their reaction might be. So biologists went back and did a food synthesis report and made a determination that, the loss of whitebark pine, while yes, it was happening and there would be less of these pine seeds available to provide protein for the bears, that they found other food sources and they weren't seeing any negative impacts to grizzly bears. So that should have led to another delisting. But it didn't, because now there were additional things that had to be done, and that gets to your point on the, dispute over how to count bears. And I don't even think it's worth getting into. That's a pretty complicated deal over the different models used to estimate bear populations and what happens if we switch models in the future. I don't even really want to get into that because I don't think it's really pertinent to this discussion, and it gets it's
super wonky.
Super wonky.
Yeah.
But just know that happened. There was an agreement about what that should be to protect bears for the foreseeable future. The Fish and Wildlife Service proposed delisting again. And again, a district court in 2018 said no. Reinstated. This was a district court judge in Montana. The prior one was also in Montana. And district court judge said, no, reinstate the listing rule for the following reasons. And they laid out a few reasons, and that's now been appealed to the circuit court. Okay, so there's your background. Now, I want to tell you why I think the current process for pursuing grizzly bear delisting is just, we need to try something different. We litigated once and lost. We're litigating again, and I would say our likelihood of success on the merits in that is low. It just is. And the way it was set up, the way it was laid out, there are still outstanding issues from the district court case that haven't been decided yet. So even if this circuit court case is decided, we could see additional litigation in the district court, which could also then again lead to further delay in delisting. My point is, it's hard to see a path where you can litigate your way to delisting this time. I say this time because we actually did litigate our way to delisting with gray wolves, right? I think grizzly bears are different. I think grizzly bears are different than gray wolves for a lot of reasons. And the politics of the country are different now than they were at that time when we were litigating gray wolf delisting and actually had congressional delisting. And I mentioned the politics because I don't think a congressional delisting of grizzly bears is an option either. I don't think the politics will support it. And again, I think grizzly bears are different. I think with gray wolves didn't exist. They'd been extirpated for generations from that area, and they were reintroduced as an experimental population, and that population took off. And there were various reasons why these 5 different court cases didn't work, and you couldn't get them delisted, and Congress finally intervened and said, we're going to let the delisting rule stand for Idaho and Montana. I just don't see that working here. So I don't see the judicial remedy in the near term. And by near term, I mean like the next 10 years. I'm not talking near term as in a year or two. I'm saying look out a decade. I don't see a judicial remedy being very likely. I don't see legislative remedy being very likely. And so that leaves one remedy that nobody is talking about. I haven't seen anybody talk about is there another path to delisting?
Well,
should I say what it is?
yeah, you should.
Okay, so here's a working theory.
Okay.
and it's not something it's not something.
So we don't see a legislative path forward at this moment in this current environment, and the litigatory one is problematic at best.
And let me really quick say on the judicial side, one of the reasons why it's problematic is because of the court that you're working through.
Yeah.
It's no secret. I'm not breaking some rule here by saying this. It's no secret that every party to litigation on these things looks for the most favorable venue to file their lawsuit.
Mm-hmm. And it's
and it's no secret that in this instance, the district court judges in Montana created the
case law is there.
It was not necessarily the case law, but the right person to write the case law, the most favorable judge to be sympathetic to this issue.
Yeah.
Is found in Montana.
And now you've got a history there and things to back up that tradition. Well, and that the momentum's there, history's there.
It's also a pipeline to the Ninth Circuit.
Yep.
And the Ninth Circuit is traditionally a more liberal circuit court, right? So you go in front of favorable district court judge in Montana, and you have a pipeline into the Ninth Circuit. Just so people are clear, the only place for grizzly bear delisting you'd be able to file this lawsuit would be Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, or Washington, D.C. Well, you're going to cross off Wyoming right away. Everybody does. Nobody wants to file that suit here. So you're left with Montana and Idaho, and both of those states are pipelines into the Ninth Circuit, but Montana had more favorable district court judges for this particular issue.
So when people sue, that's where they're taking.
They're going to go there. They're not going to go to Washington, D.C.
They're going to file it there,
so
that's where they know they're going to have to make the argument.
So for the foreseeable future, any lawsuit, any attempt to delist, and any lawsuit tied to that attempt to delist is going to be filed in Montana. Yeah. That's just until something changes. That's going to be the way it's going to be. So, how do you address that? And I'm not saying this is a perfect solution, but this is an idea I've been bouncing around in my head. So there's a provision in the Endangered Species Act. It's in Section 4D. We just call it the 4D rule, right? But Section 4D is the protective regulations portion. So basically, whenever a species is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, the Secretary of Interior can issue regulations that, in his or her discretion, he or she deems necessary and advisable to provide for the conservation of that species. So that's a pretty, what provides for the conservation of that species is a pretty broad term, and it's left to the discretion of the secretary. So secretaries have written 4D rules for lots of species, allowing certain amount of take, allowing for certain practices to occur on the landscape. So lesser prairie chicken would be a great example. Lesser prairie chicken, now they were listed for a brief time until a court overturned it, but at the same time they were listed, the service issued a 4D rule.
Which allowed for...
That 4D rule allowed for take of lesser prairie chickens, incidental take, meaning it was accidental, it wasn't on purpose, kind of take. If
ran over with a swather.
Yeah, right. Farmer or rancher was out there doing work and accidentally killed one. Another example would be northern long-eared bats. The threat to northern long-eared bats is this white nose syndrome, this fungus that ends up
causes issues that they
die from, right? And so long-eared bat are found all across the country, lots and lots of states, right? So they wrote a 4D rule that said in those states that have white nose syndrome, here are the restrictions that are going to apply. In those states that don't have white nose syndrome, business as usual, no restrictions. And so they created this flexibility with this 4D rule to allow flexible management, because the secretary deemed that was best for the conservation of the species. So here's my idea.
Okay.
And I'm willing to tell this to anybody that's going to listen.
So here's the flexible management tool for grizzly bears.
Right. So I suggest that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service write a 4D rule for grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area. First thing they'd have to do, they'd have to create a distinct population segment, and for grizzly bears, and at the same time, write this rule, 4D rule. In that 4D rule, I would suggest that they incorporate the state management plans of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Those state management plans were adopted by each state, and they were signed off on by the Fish and Wildlife Service as a condition of delisting last time. And those state management plans were not, they were really not under attack during the judicial review process. So there's nothing to say that those are not valid plans right now. So write a 4D rule that incorporates those state management plans and authorize the states through the 4D rule to manage grizzly bears pursuant to those state management plans.
So you had this argument, if I can get this right, tracking you. So the big argument, people have said, no, you can't give grizzly bears back to the states for management. They need to stay under federal control under the Endangered Species Act because, and that's the argument that these groups are making, and they keep taking it to the court to keep it under federal control. What you're saying is the feds can now come in and say, you know what, they are going to stay under our control. But here's a 4D plan because we need to be able to manage these populations that are under our control. Well, guess what? These states already have management plans that actually meet all the criteria that we have to be able to maintain the species. And so we're just going to manage them we're going to delegate, the states are going to manage these species like this. They're still listed.
Right.
But they're listed species being managed by the states in accordance with these plans that the states have for management of the species that are great and that will maintain the species keep it from going, endangered, threatened status.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the beauty of that.
So you're really just taking the plans that the states had agreed to anyway, and you're just keeping them under that other umbrella to protect, to shield them from, to create confidence in those individuals who had a problem with state control. I mean, it's really state management under the blessing of
right. And you could theoretically write something into the 4D rule that says, okay, after 5 years of this, we're going to officially delist as long as you've maintained the metrics that we deemed were required to have a recovered population for the foreseeable future, and you have the adequate regulatory mechanisms in place, which these management plans are, to be able to maintain them in the future, then we'll delist at that point. And you know what you have there? Now you have 5 years of the states actually managing.
So you have a track record that you've built while under the watchful eye of your federal partners, where you can now justify, say, why would things go differently? We've been doing this for 5 years. It seems great.
Right.
You don't need to be here anymore. Here's a question for you. This is going to be the $1 million question, right?
Right.
Some of those state management plans include hunting.
Right.
So could they?
So there's going to be some debate about this.
Mm-hmm.
I think it depends on how you word it. But if you can argue that it's necessary and advisable to provide for conservation of the species, then yes. I don't know that you'd call it hunting. I think you'd call it something a little bit
population
different.
Control.
But it would be a discretionary mortality. And it might be if there are problem bears that states are going to remove anyway. And let's keep in mind that there are problem bears that are lethally removed right now.
Absolutely.
And
all the
quite
time.
A few, yes.
And a lot of people don't understand this.
Right. And so instead of having an agency come in there
and paying somebody a whole bunch of money to then use the gun that the agency is paying for and the bolt that the agency is paid for.
Right. Perhaps they just bring a deputized person out. And that's not something that's not out of the ordinary. That's been done in different places. That's been done in Rocky Mountain National Park for elk. That's been done in Grand Teton National Park.
Yeah, it's basically a third-party contractor.
That's exactly what it is.
But in this case, the contractor maybe even is paying you rather than the other way around.
Could be. So there are ways to make that work. I'm absolutely convinced of it. Would that be a huge fight? That would probably, yes. That would probably create litigation in and of itself under a 4D rule.
Yeah.
But remember what I said, that one of the challenges you have with this litigating yourselves to delisting right now is you wind up back in front of this Montana judge over and over again.
Uh-huh.
Under this method, you're writing a state-specific 4D. So you'd have three.
Yeah, so
you'd
it's
have
not
three
going to
4D
Montana.
rules. So it's not going to Montana. If you have
Unless
a problem
it's Montana's.
unless it's Montana's. But if it's Wyoming's 4D rule, if you have a problem with Wyoming's 4D rule, you're going to have to file that case in Wyoming.
And if it's in Idaho, it's going to be in Idaho.
Or in D.C.
Yep.
Or in D.C.
Or in Washington. Yep.
So it addresses that venue issue. The other thing it does, and you probably will have litigation on this, but like I said, it addresses that venue issue. But you know what it does? It gets states in management. States get to start management of those species now, right? Yeah. And it's not this.
So you're not waiting for the lawsuits to come to a hopefully favorable, and then just try again and bash your head against the wall again and bash your head against the wall again. Instead, you're getting an opportunity today to manage it the way that you think it should be managed, which, by the way, is through this management plan, which Fish and Wildlife has already agreed is a solid management plan that will, ensure the future of that species. So we already have a direction forward. We already know how it works. We already have the...
Well, here's the other thing, too. If the Fish and Wildlife Service says grizzly bears are recovered and we're going to move to delist them, we're going to move forward with delisting. And that delisting rule gets challenged in court. And typically, when that gets challenged in court, there'll be an injunction that prevents them from going into effect. That's what happened here.
Mm-hmm.
It'll happen again. So that happens. What happens then? You just fall back on the 4D rule that's already still in place. So you're pushing to be able to say, we're going to take this federal umbrella off and the states are going to continue to manage just as they've been managing. And while that lawsuit's going on and playing out, you're still managing.
Yeah. So then they're like, we want an injunction. You're like, okay.
Yeah.
Because it's just really the same thing. The difference is the placard of the person who's ultimately in charge.
And it's the beauty of the 4D rule. I've seen this in multiple cases now, not something as big or controversial as a grizzly bear, right? But I've seen it with other species that were controversial, where states had fought the listing determination over it. In fact, right down to fighting the genetics of whether it was a species or not. And then the service wrote a 4D rule to help protect the interests that felt that they were most at threat by the listing. And once that 4D rule went into effect, it was working swimmingly, and nobody talks about it anymore. The controversy goes away, and nobody talks about it anymore. Do I think that would happen with grizzly bears? Probably not. They're just a controversial species. But from the state standpoint, do I think that the states... You'd start seeing more buy-in to the Endangered Species Act if you have some actual management. I'm just suggesting,
it has potential. The idea has big potential.
Poke all the holes in it you want. I'd love to hear the holes in it, but all I'm trying to do is propose let's start thinking outside of the box, people, because I don't think we can litigate ourselves out of this situation, and we surely aren't going to be able to get Congress to judicially delist or to legislatively delist these things. So if you want to see a recovered species delisted so resources can go to other species, getting species that are truly at risk and imperiled recovered and off the list, if you want some of those resources to go to those species, here's a suggestion.
No, it's a really great...
here's an idea.
It's having not had any more time than this to consider it, it's an intriguing proposition and possibility. The idea that we can take, basically it's training wheels. You can put the training wheels on there and have the training wheels, whether you want to say that is conditional, that's still having federal oversight or whatever as the bicycle gets going. You do have those training wheels there to hopefully assuage some of the concerns of those people who are on the outside who are going to go, oh my goodness, we could never let states do this or do that. Well, now you have an opportunity to move forward on a trial basis without having to have the concern of like delisting it, relisting it. It's just it's really it's an artful solution.
And if the 4D rule doesn't work, the secretary can come in and change it. I mean, the secretary still has the final authority, right? Which, by the way, because of that, states are going to feel compelled to make sure that they don't do something that
states aren't going to screw this up.
They don't want to screw that up.
And we say this all over again. We've said this before with before when we're trying to get something in state control, we've said like, look, once you get this species into states controls, states have never screwed that up once they've gone into state.
Yeah,
because
I think I've said it. I don't know how many times.
Yeah,
but every species,
they've never come back on the list.
Yeah, no species that's ever been delisted due to recovery has ever been relisted. Meaning, states have, once they got the resources in place and a management plan in place, and got them delisted, they managed them.
But this is
just managing them.
This is just a longer time period of handing off the baton.
It is, but it's a model that you can try here, and if it works, you might be able to apply a model like this
in a lot of other areas.
A lot of other species.
That's exactly what I was thinking when you were talking about it. I was like, you have this unique opportunity with grizzly bears to do it here, but isn't this really the solution that we were looking for across the board with the Endangered Species Act?
And frankly, if it
Instead
can work
suing on every species every time,
and if it can work with grizzly bears, there's nothing it can't work for. Like, you take the most controversial species, this thing that causes, I mean, you and I have both seen it. We've seen people in tears over grizzly bears. I've taken phone calls from people sobbing when they heard that a particular bear, whether it was Scarpface or, one of these named bears in the park, died. They get emotional about it. People are emotionally attached to bears and the wildness that they represent that have never seen one in the wild before.
It's unique.
Go ahead.
I want to use my favorite word. It's challenging because, and it's not just this issue. We've talked about other issues. We will talk about other issues. When you talk about people and you break something down to an individual, some person who really loves that animal and has a personal relationship with individuals of that species, it doesn't matter what that animal is. It's like, that's really difficult when you're talking about managing an entire species and how you develop strategies for management that affect not only that species but ecosystems, because they always come back to that one individual. They're not looking at the dynamics at a larger scale and how we grow this entire pie and make the entire system better. They're looking at that individual impact.
Right. You're right.
It's challenging.
So that's why I think it's going to be really, really hard. I'm not saying that this solution is an easy one by any means, but if you can do this, and if you can put together a plan that works for grizzly bears, that gets them on the path to state management and recovery, it's hard for me to think that you can find another species where it won't work. So this is a great test case too. Don't pick I always say, sometimes, I don't always say this, but I'm going to say it here. You don't always have to pick the low-hanging fruit. Sometimes pick the highest piece of fruit, because if you can get that one, you can get everything else.
Yeah.
and so this is one where
I've enjoyed this
you can get grizzly bears. I think you can get everything else. So anyway, that's my 2 cents, my appeal to the public on a potential path forward.
Tell us we're wrong. I dare you.
Yeah, and we probably are. Maybe we're not.
No, love to hear the reasons why you don't think it works.
And if you got a better idea, let us know.
Yeah, unless it's really nutty, and then don't. Just keep it to yourself. But you know what we're going to talk about next time?
I don't.
I've enjoyed this discussion. Next time we talk about hunting with a guide.
Let's just take on all the easy ones. And I think you're probably referencing the Wyoming law.
Yes.
That non-residents must have a guide to hunt in wilderness areas.
Tell me what you think.
Yeah.
Or don't right now.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. But until we get to that, you have anything else you want to add?
Nope.
Hey, until we get to that, everybody, again, thanks for listening. Chime in if you have thoughts on this and any other podcast, as always. And remember, until next time, that life is about experiences. So go have one.